Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're calling in from. Thank you so much for joining us at the 100 Innovation Summit. We are so excited for this youth interview with Andreas Schleicher. My name is Dustin Liu. I'm currently serving as the U.S. Youth Observer to the United Nations. I am so excited to be joined here with Alice, who will be participating as a co-host for this conversation. Alice, over to you.
Hello, so I'm Alice. I am 15 years old and I'm currently a youth ambassador from HundrED, and I'm very excited to be here today with you guys. So I'd like to welcome Andreas right now.
And good to meet you, Dustin and Alice. Pleasure to work with you tonight.
Awesome. Andreas, I'm wondering if we can start off by you sharing a little bit about your role and the work that you lead at the OECD.
Yes, I'm Director for Education and Skills at the OECD. That means, building ways of comparing the strengths and weaknesses of education around the world and helping education systems move through this very difficult situation in these days.
Absolutely. And I'm sure right now in the COVID-19 context, we're seeing that on another level. And I'm curious if we can start there. The description of a well-rounded education, when we think about what we would hope, what skills and competences we hope that every student leaves with when they finish formal schooling, what comes up for you and how would you describe a well-rounded education?
Well, I think we should expect students to be able to think for themselves and to work with others, people who are different from them, who may think differently from them. It's about our capacity to imagine, to create, to build something of intrinsic positive worth. It's also about our capacity to manage tensions and dilemmas. The world is no longer black and white. Often we need to navigate ambiguity, manage complexity. But perhaps most important is the capacity to mobilize your cognitive, social, and emotional resources to take action, to do something. Now, we know a lot of things. We can do a lot of things. But actually, our capacity to bring that to action is perhaps the most important aspect. In a way, the advent of artificial intelligence pushes us to think much harder what it means to be human. And I think that's the most important aspect.
I really love how you just focused on those human skills, those qualities that can't be replaced by robots, right? It can't be replaced by AI. As we think about the future of work, which is constantly evolving, and especially right now when we're in a virtual environment, I feel like it's sped up in its nature. There seems to be an absence for a lot of folks, the idea of real skill building in preparation for life. So how do we keep pace with the changing work environment and translate that within a school setting? How do we create the conditions where young people are gaining those skills practically that you mentioned, those skills of imagination, those skills of being able to grapple with complex issues? How do we build that in a school environment?
Well, the dilemma for schooling is that the kind of things that are easy to teach and maybe easy to test have also become easy to digitize, to automate, to outsource. The world no longer rewards you just for what you know. Now, Google knows everything. The world rewards you for what you can do with what you know, how you can mobilize yourself. Now, that is, I think, the dilemma. And if we want to sort of build that student agency, we need to give students room to experiment, to do something, not to be passive recipients, but to be active learners, to be co-creators of immersive learning settings. And we do actually see in many schools, many teachers striving for that. No longer sort of transmitting knowledge, but teachers becoming good coaches, good mentors, good facilitators, good evaluators. So I think there is that transition underway. But I think the most important part is if we want students to be active, we have to give them room to actually exercise activity. Now, schools are often very good to keep students inside and the rest of the world outside. And the more bridges we can build between the learner and the real world, the better we will educate people for for the real world. Sometimes it's great to combine work with study. Some vocational educational programs actually are doing better than academic programs in sort of helping young people to work on real problems, to work with real people, to solve real problems that have real consequences. So I do think we can create those kinds of learning environments that facilitate this.
Absolutely. And what I really appreciate there is you're describing what we need for change makers, where you're describing the students that we need in order to push against these really complex global issues. And I think as part of that, we need creativity. So I'll pass it over to Alice to lead us into a conversation about ways in which we can foster creativity in our schools.
Yeah, I really like that part about giving room to students, and I believe that this is very important. So I have a question. How can we make sure, what is one thing that we could change in schools to make students' creativity flourish?
Yeah, if you want young people to be creative, you have to give them room to maneuver, to experiment. If they experiment, they will need to take risk. If they take risks, they will make mistakes. And if our education systems are not very good in helping students learn from and with mistakes, probably the young people will not become so creative. And what's behind that is what we call a growth mindset. The belief that actually, you own the learning process, that you can change things, as opposed to, it's all made up with my genes and my social background. So where young people have that sense, I can change things. I have that ownership, that kind of growth mindset. We will most likely also see young people who are willing to exercise agency, willing to take responsibility, and that is the foundation of creativity. And creativity is not something, it's this one in a million idea. Creativity is something that we can actually exercise in every situation, every day, if we have the space for that and the support for that.
I think something that I've heard from educators who are not yet bought into this idea is that they're skeptical that creativity is such a crucially important skill. I often like to share with educators that I work with that the imagination of a second grader is so important and we need to keep that flame alive. So I'm curious for you, what is something that you say to educators that you have felt has helped move that conversation forward? How do you help people understand that creativity is just so important and is a crucial skill that our students should have leaving our formal schooling?
Well, I don't think there are many people who would dispute the importance of creativity, but I think there are many people who are not quite sure how we develop that best. No? In a way, the most creative people are the smallest children. They try out everything, something new. They cross all bridges, and they, make every effort. They go through every boundary, and somehow we lose that kind of capacity. We get more afraid of change. We become more entrenched in our ways of thinking. We don't think so much out of the box as small children. And as an educator, if you actually are really fostering creativity, it means, you do not teach young people the established wisdom of our times, but actually you help them to question the established wisdom of our times. And that means they will question you as a teacher. Sort of, you're going to see a very different dynamic. And that's what I mean when I talk about co-creating learning situation. I think that's the difficulty that many educators face. It's not the importance of creativity, but it's actually how do we actually foster creative thinking and creative working.
Speaking about disrupting norms and being able to, deal with complex and adaptive situations, what we're experiencing right now in the COVID-19 context is certainly an example of that. And I think in terms of this COVID-19 context, we've seen that the digital divide when it comes to education, as education moves to a virtual environments, has become really salient. I'm curious if you can share a little bit about what education stakeholders can do to mend this gap to ensure that even in a COVID-19 context, we are ensuring quality education for all.
Yeah, this digital divide has many dimensions. I mean, the first dimension is simply physical access to technology. You need to sort of be able to access the digital world in order to participate in it. But that's actually by far not enough. In fact, there are many learners who do have access to technology and still are not taking real benefit from this. Because if you want to, learn in a digital world, you actually have to know how to learn. You have to be able to set your own learning goals. You have to manage your learning process. You have to have this kind of intrinsic curiosity. And young people who have that, who have access to technology, and who have a supportive ecosystem around them, teachers included, parents included. For them, this COVID crisis is maybe liberating and exciting. But for the many young people who used to be spoon-fed by their teachers, they were passive recipients of chunks of knowledge, who may have never liked school in the first place. They're not the ones who are going to be benefiting now from the digital world. And that's the much harder digital divide to bridge. How do we actually create that motivation and capacity for learning throughout your life? Now that's, I think, where we have to work much harder on. The technical divide, I think, is something we can resolve fairly quickly. And we have actually addressed it in many, many places. But the attitudinal, the motivational divide. Now, if young people have been passive learners for all their lives, suddenly to actually be able to take ownership of your own learning is a big, big step forward. So we should be taking that lesson from us with this pandemic and create a learning environment that creates more room for young people to own their learning processes. That's what the future will require from us. In the past, you could learn once for your lifetime. You leave school, you have all the tools you need throughout your life. We used to learn to do the work, no? And now learning is the work. Basically, in the future, you're going to be only successful if you can expand your own horizon every day. And that requires a very, very different mindset. That's the real digital divide. Now, those people who are capable of doing it, they will find, expanding opportunity. And those who basically do not, they will be quickly locked into their old ways of thinking.
I completely agree with what you just said. I've been personally experiencing this in the situation of COVID, and it's so hard for us students and the teachers to step up and take control of our education, because now we are kind of alone. So I really see what you're talking about, and I completely agree with it. So continuing talking about reaching all students everywhere, that you said it's possible, we are already doing it. What would you say is the biggest challenge when referring to granting educational access to all young people?
Yeah, again, you need to physically reach your students. You need to know where they are. But much more important, if the students sit in a classroom as a teacher, you can just broadcast knowledge and you can assume the students are receiving that. When students are at home, you need to continue to have a great passion for your subject. Now, that's really what always, inspires students. You need to understand how different students learn differently. That's also very important. But most importantly, you need to know your students. That's so much more important now than it was in the pre-COVID period, where they are all in front of you. Now you need to understand, how do you reach them? And we also have to remember that learning is not a transactional process, where we disseminate information. It's always a relational process. The school subjects which you like most in primary school, now that may have very little to do with the content, but it's most likely something about that teacher. It's the teachers who, understood your passions, your dreams, who supported you. That kind of relational component is vital now. Now, where students, the one thing that students will remember 10 years from now from this crisis is most likely exactly that teacher, the teacher who reached out to them, the teacher who understood them, the teacher who gave them support when they were needing it. So reaching all learners really requires that kind of social fabric in education. It requires, of course, the networks of information, like ways of basically bringing students together, the online education. But most importantly, it requires that kind of social fabric in education. And that's very, very hard to create for all students. No? Because even in school systems in very wealthy countries, where every student sits in school, some people would say, well, everybody has access to education. But that doesn't mean that everybody really learns, that everybody is really inspired. That is what, access for all really, really means. That is not about, putting everybody in an institution, but it's ensuring that everybody can develop their full potential.
I think what you're hitting at here is really the power of education, the ability for education to really transform the ways in which we see ourselves as change makers, see ourselves as creative folks, see ourselves as being able to navigate really complex situations. And you touched on this idea of international education, how we really need to push forward those ideals in classrooms across the world, not just putting students in institutions. And on the vein of that question, how can international organizations intervene in countries and ensure the quality of education that you're describing without disrespecting sovereignty or political options?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's so much a question of intervention, really. I think what international organizations can do best is opening the eyes of people. In a way, I think one of the problems that we have in education, that it's a very inward, focusing business. Sometimes a teacher doesn't look outside to the next teacher. Sometimes schools do not collaborate with other schools. And often education systems know very little about other education systems where they can learn from. In 2012, when we had our PISA study in mathematics, the British education minister went to go to Shanghai, because Shanghai was the system that did best on this assessment. And she, came from Britain, but she was a mathematics teacher. She was so interested, so inspired by what teachers were doing. So she was then bringing teachers from China to the UK to create an exchange among teachers, to build kind of a foundation for mutual understanding. We can teach in very different ways. And I think that is what international organizations can really do. In this COVID pandemic, at the OECD, we have been very, very active to share knowledge about, remote learning, digital learning, 21st century pedagogies. Those are the things. As a knowledge broker, in a way, our greatest strength is not to tell anybody what to do, but our greatest strength is to tell everybody what everybody else is doing, and then to help people learn from those kinds of experiences.
I think that is so powerful, the idea that we need to build better together. And passing it over to Alice now, helping us sum up this conversation. What's our next step?
Yeah, so summing up the entire conversation, we wanted to know, what will education look like in 2030? What can you talk about?
Well, I think it starts with a very different conception about the what young people need to be able to do. Education as something that builds curiosity, opening minds, as education that builds compassion, opening hearts, as education that, builds the capacity of people to mobilize their cognitive and social and emotional resources. Courage, leadership, resilience, those are very, very important attributes. And for me, these are also our best weapons against the biggest threats of our times. Ignorance, the closed mind, hate, the closed heart, and, losing our power to do something, the enemy of agency. So I think that question is very, very important in 2030, that we see the goals of education in a very, very different way. And once again, thinking carefully about what are the functions that artificial intelligence, technology will be able to taking over, the kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to test. And think about what are our human, knowledge, the skills, the attitudes and values that make us human, and fostering those. I think a clearer image of that in 2030 is going to be very important. And that brings us to the learning environments. How do we organize learning that fosters that knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values? Pedagogies that make students much more active learners, that make learning a much more participatory process. Learning environments that build bridges between the real world and the world of learning, where students actually go out in the world to experience and to do something early on, take responsibility. And that brings us to the question of, who are the educators that can do those kinds of things? Now, they move from, people who just, teach a subject, to people who develop, young people, and take a personal interest in the development of the human skills that are very important. And then, you can ask yourself, what are the education systems in 2030 that is actually going to support those educators to do that job? Now, we have still a very, very industrial way of educating people. There's someone in the ministry who thinks about, what should millions of students learn, and they print a lot of school books and they bring them to the people, and we educate teachers to do all of this learning in standardized way, assessing people in standardized way. That's a very, very kind of industrial approach. And then teachers are often like exchangeable widgets on an assembly line, And I think moving away from that industrial work organization to a much more professional organization of work, where we foster entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship in young people means entrepreneurship in teachers, in school leaders, in the learning environments. And I think that work organization, that's really, I think, the challenge for public policy in these days. And the pandemic has really highlighted that the old no longer works. We do not yet know how the new will unfold, but I think that's the challenge that we will have in the years up to 2030.
Thank you so much for your answer. So at HundrED, we talk a lot about finding ways for every child to flourish. So how can we, as young people, participate with simple actions in making the future of education better?
Well, actually, I think HundrED is an amazing platform which does that every day. So I think nobody knows how to do that better. It's about, finding the good entrepreneurs, the good ideas, fostering the entrepreneurship, scaling and spreading them. And I think that stands in sharp contrast to much of our traditional education system that push, a lot of ideas top down into schools rather than thinking about where are those good ideas? How can we find and scale and spread them? And I think that's exactly what HundrED does so well, bringing together people who have ideas and giving them the platform. And that's, the power of the world in which we live in, the technology-based world. The most important companies these days, they all have, the product before they have the money. And they start with a big idea, not with a big industry. And that's, I think, for me, very much the image of HundrED. Yeah, I believe that HundrED actually is a fantastic example of fostering that entrepreneurship. It's about not, pushing ideas into schools. It's about finding the good ideas and finding ways to scale and spread them. And I do think that's really what education in 2030 should be looking like. But Alice, tell me about your vision of 2030. How would you, as a young person growing up, how do you imagine your own education in 2030 and the education maybe of the next generation?
So I imagine it being so much more student-centered and student-led. So the voices of students should be really growing up in the next few years, also with a lot of new technology entering schools, and maybe without the barriers of classrooms and the school place. So I think we will be learning on the streets, on different kinds of places, and talking to different kinds of people, because we're gonna be really growing our horizons and expanding what we know and what we think is valuable as learning and as a society. So I hope that we can see these changes very soon and in 2030.
When you say listening to a student voice, how do we listen to the voices of students, and who should listen to them?
So I think all the people should listen to them, because we need to focus on what they think, since it's their education. So if we have students, the teachers need to listen to them, the directors of the school. Even if schools who are totally controlled by students, there are a lot of them already in the world, we can see that. And yeah, just asking what they think, just knowing that their opinion is valuable for us. And what do you think, Dustin, about that?
Yes, Dustin, you have a view on that as well? How we can actually mobilize student voice and also make sure that student voice actually feeds into the design and implementation of education?
Absolutely. I think that we need to, one, Alice, going off of what you were saying, center youth voices, but understanding that youth voices have a lot of wisdom. I think when I think about what I want education to look like in 2030, I always share that I want every young person to see themselves as problem solvers. I think oftentimes we throw problems onto young people or antagonize the idea that young people are the troublemakers, when in reality, I see young people around the world truly making change on these really complex global issues. So in 2030, I hope that every young person feels as though they have the capacity to make change, are given the tools to make change in school, and feel like they are problem solvers for the challenges that we really need young people to help tackle.
I agree very much. This kind of problem-solving capacity is going to be very, very important, and not just technical problems, also social problems. But, who, in your view, should imagine the problems? Isn't that the even bigger challenge, that we actually ask the right question, imagine the right tasks ahead of us?
Absolutely. And I think that's a question that we are going to offer the audience. Who needs to imagine these challenges? How do we keep these conversations going? I want to thank Andreas and Alice so much for your time and your participation. Let's keep these conversations going. Let's keep imagining what education can look like in 2030. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Back to the studio.
Thank you.